Hello and welcome back to Movie Husbands. Today we are reviewing The Missing. Directed by Carl Joseph Papa, The Missing follows Eric, an animator without a mouth. After a routine checkup on his uncle, a familiar alien arrives who wants to take Eric away from Earth. The event causes him to remember his past and unravel his memories. The film stars Carlo Aquino, Gahol, and Dolly de Leon. So Jeffrey, before we get into this review, I just want to mention that this is the Philippines entry for the 2023 Academy Awards. It is the first animated feature to ever be submitted for the Academy Awards in the Philippines, which is kind of a cool fact. We also got a screener to see this movie, so we are seeing it before it is released in the States. But other than that, what did you think of The Missing?
I think The Missing is certainly an interesting film. It's using animation to its benefit to make a humanist drama, because a lot of what it's interested in are these human relationships and things on Earth, and particularly with trauma, which becomes quite interesting as an alien is introduced to us. You say, how could this film be about humanist concerns? You know, I always like to take a film and put it into the context of what came before it. So I couldn't think of this film and its subject matter without thinking of the filmmaker Greg Araki, who made a variety of queer-centric films in the 90s and early 2000s, and particularly a film called Mysterious Skin that this film is very similar to in its subject matter, and they have radically different approaches to it, but I couldn't help but think about this film. This film certainly has a cult following among people who are really into film and into Greg Araki. If you're watching the beginning of this review and you hear Mysterious Skin and you say, oh, I love that film, I think this is a film you should certainly check out. I thought that this film had a lot of interesting things about it in its human developments and its writing that I thought were quite good and worth commending.
Yeah, let's get started with the animation here, because this film employs two different types of animation: your more traditional hand-drawn animation and another animation which is called rotoscoping, which I believe I had most recently seen utilized in Flea, which came out I think a year or two ago.
Yeah, but apparently I was on the Wikipedia page for rotoscoping today, and apparently this has been used in various like infantile forms since like the 40s.
Yeah.
I didn't realize that, but for me, I was first exposed to it with a couple of films that Richard Linklater made in the 90s, Waking Life, and another film called The Scanner Darkly that he made a little later.
So if you're not familiar, rotoscoping is the process of actually filming a scene in real life and then animating over the actor's actions. And that's mostly because it is a stylistic choice, especially when it comes to this movie. One of those stylistic choices that they're able to do is with our main character, Eric, is that he's missing certain body parts. Or shall I say, he starts losing body parts throughout the movie, but the one that he does not have at the beginning is his mouth. So he cannot talk. So he goes around and he uses a board to communicate. So he writes on this whiteboard when he needs to tell somebody something. So he's working as a job as an animator, and in his office, he comes across another coworker, a boy who is also working, and he helps him out one night, and this little friendship blossoms. Also a little bit of a love interest blossoms. So upon going to visit his uncle at his mom's request, this ends up opening pretty much a can of worms when it comes to the plot, and this movie really devolves from there in terms of his past and his relationship with his uncle.
I want to go back quickly to the animation styles that you were talking about and how it's using these styles. In particular, the flashback sequences or the UFO sequences are in these like this much more cute, rudimentary animated style, something you would see in like the 80s and 90s from Walt Disney. I did think from a purely stylistic perspective that both of these styles were really effective, and they were effective in doing some world building on their own that the film doesn't necessarily have time to do. Where a flashback may seem kind of boring or just run of the mill in a live action film, this film is able to use that new animation to quickly distinguish itself from the story, which I thought was a really interesting technique.
Two very distinct styles of animation, and they do stand out from one another. Sometimes I found this a little bit jarring at first, but as the movie progresses, this traditional style of animation really has a place in the movie. And once you understand where it comes from and why it's being done that way, the whole thing makes sense.
Yeah, and I'd say that both animation styles are fairly rich in detail. Like they both have these extraordinary worlds that are really amazing to get lost in if you're staring at the screen and you're looking for all these little set building details. This leads into maybe my first flaw of the film is that the alien scenes didn't totally work for me. I understand why they're there. I understand what they were going for. I think the filmmakers' intention with what they were trying to convey, but ultimately it did take me out of the film a little bit. I think I was most touched by this film's humanism and this blossoming friendship turned relationship between our main character Eric and Carlo. And this film has such this soft, gentle, humanist touch that I was really interested in. And every time the UFO stuff came back, and again, it does have a bit of a payoff towards the end. I'm not like thrilled with the metaphor, but towards the end of the film, it does make sense why it's there. But every time it came about, I just felt like I was being taken away from something that I was enjoying so much and felt so touched by.
The reason that this type of animation is being done this certain way has a very specific purpose in the movie.
Yeah.
I completely agree that it would throw me off a little bit because it stood out so much, but it's hard to not respect it because it's very personal and it means something very particular. So there was a lot of intention put into why it looks the way it does, even though it is jarring. And I found that actually really complemented the film from a narrative perspective. I do want to go into talking about Eric and Carlo's relationship in this movie because I thought that was the highlight of the film. Carlo plays this character where he is basically being thrown into this sci-fi world of aliens that he doesn't quite understand.
Yeah.
And it takes a lot from somebody to come across somebody else who is struggling in a certain way and having to get on their level and understand where they're coming from and why they are acting out the way that they are.
Yeah, I was very touched at how unassuming and non-judgmental Carlo was towards Eric. This is not a film that's very safe. It's a film that takes a lot of chances, and I don't think it was done perfectly, but I love the thoughtfulness with which this filmmaker was using animation to his advantage.
I completely agree. And I do want to talk a little bit more about the acting because we were briefly talking about the characters in this film. I do want to point out that, like, in considering that this movie is being rotoscoped, it puts a lot more pressure on the actors to convey something because so much has to come across in your physical abilities as an actor.
Totally.
And
Yeah, I didn't think of that.
thought in particular, Carlo Aquino did a really great job here because he really comes across as very nervous and shy and unsure of himself. You could tell it in his slightly hunched over shoulders and the way he doesn't sit up completely straight. And so I thought he played this super well because it got so much across about his character that you wouldn't necessarily get unless you were seeing the actual footage. Also, I want to talk briefly about Dolly de Leon because we were most recently seeing her in Triangle of Sadness.
Robbed of an Oscar nomination. So sorry, do not like that movie. I did not think it was successful. However, she is the best part of it.
She was a very good part of that movie. And she makes a reappearance in this film. She plays Eric's mother, and she actually holds a lot of the little comedic elements in the film, I would say, because she's this very much overbearing mother that likes to call her son and just check up on him and see what he's doing and just talk a lot. Also, just this sweet motherly role that turns into something very comforting by the end of the movie.
So you mentioned the ending. I won't talk about the ending in any kind of detail because this film hasn't been conventionally released. I don't think a lot of people have seen it. But I will say that I thought the ending scene was actually the best scene in the movie, which is one of my favorite things about seeing films. And frankly, there's nothing better than when a film goes out on a high note. One of the things that really bothers me in films is when films go on too long, when they had a clear spot where it was most powerful that it could have ended and then it goes on for another 15 minutes, which is a thing that this film does not do. This film ends, I think, at the height of its power, which is really something I always want to see in a film.
I completely agree. I thought it was such a poignant moment to end the film and had so much to say about the movie itself, which I'll say a little bit more in my wrap-up once we go into grades.
Yeah, and there's a variety of symbolic concerns. There's a variety of thematic concerns that only make sense once we get to that point. So you have this feeling of a film coming together all in its last frames, which I really enjoyed.
So you ready to go to grades?
Yes, I'm ready to go to grades. I'm going to give this film a B. I think that for the most part, it was a lovely watch. Again, I did find those UFO scenes to be pretty jarring. It didn't totally coalesce for me, and that's okay because I think that there's a lot in this film that's worth commending. I think there's a lot worth looking into. In particular, I know I said humanist like 4 times, but the humanist aspect of this film where we're diving into friendships, we're diving into trauma, we're diving into the origin of certain relationships that I thought was really the strongest part. And that's where the film chooses to end. That's where it chooses to make its final statements. And I thought that those final statements were really successful. So I really enjoyed this film.
Yeah, I completely agree. I also give this movie a B as well. And I thought it was just a wonderful story about the way that people can overcome certain things or learn to regain power in what was lost through trauma. I think that is a very big part of this movie, and learning how to be able to talk about these things with people that you care about. I really appreciate this movie for tackling all that it did. It seemed like it was a very personal story. I think as this movie progresses and you learn and you pick up what's happening here, the moments that are in the traditional animation that seems a little rudimentary and childish ends up carrying so much more traumatic heft as the movie progresses and you figure out what's going on. Some of these scenes got very disturbing at certain points when you realize what it is that's actually happening. And I really appreciate the movie for taking on that tough subject matter and also doing something with it that I don't think we see very often in film, even though we've seen the same subject matters. And that's really taking a lot of metaphorical things, for example, losing your voice and how to find it again. All right, and that's it for our review of The Missing. The Missing will be having its US premiere at the Palm Springs International Film Festival coming up in January. So when this film comes out, we definitely highly recommend checking it out. As always, thank you guys for watching, and we'll see you next time.